My name is Ariana. I am 35 years old, and I currently live and work in Chicago as the chief financial officer of an investment firm. 5 years ago, I thought I had married the man of my life. 5 years later, I stood in the middle of a lavish banquet hall, my evening gown not even settled on the chair yet, when my father-in-law Richard raised his glass, tapped it lightly, and smiled at all the guests. Our family needs someone who can bring forth the next generation, he said clearly. And unfortunately, Ariana cannot do that. After a round of polite laughter came the white envelope placed on the table in front of me. Inside was the divorce paper already signed by my husband, Ethan. I couldn't utter a word. Everyone around fell silent. A few whispered. Others just stared at me as if they were watching a tragicomedy play. And just when I thought this humiliation had reached rock bottom, a familiar hand rested on my shoulder from behind. Laura, the best friend I thought I had lost contact with, walked into the middle of the banquet, pulled out another envelope. She placed it in front of Richard, her voice cold. Now it's your turn to receive a gift. Why should a woman be discarded just because she cannot have children? And what could be in that envelope that made my husband's entire family panic? If you have ever felt judged by your own relatives, share with me in the comments. Hit like if you feel angry on my behalf. Don't forget to subscribe to follow the next part because this story has only just begun. I once believed happiness was something solid, like the two-story red brick house Ethan and I chose after our wedding. A quiet neighborhood, rows of maple trees changing color with the seasons, and every weekend morning filled with the sound of children riding bikes outside. I remember the feeling of stepping into that house for the first time, my heart overflowing with hope, as if we had just laid the foundation for the life we both dreamed of. I met Ethan at Northwestern University. He studied architecture, I studied finance. We bumped into each other at a small cafe near the main library, where he was sketching a greenhouse design while I was buried in spreadsheets. His laptop ran out of battery, so he asked to borrow mine. I laughed and handed him my charger too. A few months later, we drifted from friends to lovers as if everything had been predestined. Ethan used to be the one who could make me laugh even on the worst days, and I once believed our love was strong enough to withstand any trial. After the wedding, I turned down a job offer in New York to stay in Chicago, close to his family. Ethan said his father, Richard, wanted to keep him in the company. I didn't object. I liked the idea of a close family, multiple generations living near one another, gathering for dinner every weekend. Ethan and I moved to Glenview, where houses had wide lawns and American flags hanging on porches. I worked for an investment firm and rose quickly, while he began managing projects for his family's corporation. People often called us the perfect couple, and honestly, I thought so too. But behind closed doors, no one knew I had taken pregnancy tests every month for nearly 3 years. I taped them inside my closet like people put up children's photos, except mine all showed single lines. I took prescription vitamins, tried acupuncture, yoga, cut sugar, cut coffee, cut alcohol. I once thought if I worked hard enough, results would come, like every other goal in my life. But my body refused to follow any plan. Richard's pressure began as gentle reminders during dinners. Young people like you tend to wait, but opportunities don't come twice. Gradually, those turned into criticism. A family like ours needs a clear air. We can't let everything fall into outsiders' hands. Each time, Ethan would laugh it off and squeeze my hand, but he never once spoke up to defend me. His silence told me it was something I was expected to accept. One night, I asked him, "What if we never have children?" Ethan didn't answer right away. He looked out the window and finally said, "I think my father would never accept that." That sentence sent a chill through me. I began to feel like a failed investment. Every encounter with Margaret, my mother-in-law, felt like a performance review, her eyes darting to my stomach with a polite but hollow smile. She often spoke about her friends' grandchildren, about children who inherit the best from both sides. Each time, I forced a smile and changed the subject, while inside I felt pierced by invisible needles. I started avoiding family gatherings, claiming work, but in truth, I could no longer bear being measured like an underperforming report. Ethan retreated further into silence. He still worked, still kissed me goodnight, but his gaze had changed. No longer the look of a man building a home, but of someone weighing whether it was worth keeping. I suggested we both get fertility testing, but he refused. I don't want to. It makes everything feel broken. I didn't push. I understood, but I also saw clearly we were no longer a team. In the fourth year, I had an ectopic pregnancy. Those were the scariest weeks of my life. I found out one Monday morning. I cried when I saw 2 lines. I texted Ethan immediately, saying I would keep it secret until things were stable, then share the news with his family. But only 2 days later, I collapsed with pain and had to be rushed to the hospital. When I woke, the doctor said my fallopian tube had ruptured and surgery was necessary. I remember Ethan's face. Clearly, he didn't hold me, just placed a hand on my shoulder and whispered, "Maybe it just wasn't the right time." After that day, I never brought up pregnancy with him again. We went on as if nothing had happened. I returned to work after 2 weeks, while Ethan buried himself in a new project in San Diego. He was away constantly, claiming the construction required him. I stopped asking. I became the busy woman who went to work early, came home late, set alarms in the middle of the night to track ovulation, but no one noticed, especially not his family. I will never forget one Sunday dinner when Richard raised his glass and declared at the crowded table, "I don't want surprises. I need clarity. If there is no grandchild by next year, we'll have to reconsider the future of the company." At that moment, I was serving myself Margaret's lasagna. I set my fork down, swallowed hard, and said nothing. Ethan remained silent. I quietly excused myself, went into the bathroom, locked the door, and leaned against the mirror. My hands trembled, though the room was perfectly still. No one knocked. No one asked if I was okay. And I realized I was living among people who saw me as a production tool, not a human being with feelings, limits, and my own aspirations. That was when I began gathering evidence. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I refused to one day be thrown out of the home I had poured sweat into without anyone asking for my consent. I began noticing Ethan's changes not through big actions, but through small details. His face when answering late-night calls, the way he cleared his browser history, how his eyes no longer lingered on me for more than 3 seconds during dinner. The silence between us grew so heavy I felt like I was sharing a roof with a stranger who once called me family. That month, Ethan said he had to go to San Francisco to supervise an important project. Instead of 3 days as usual, he stayed nearly 2 weeks. He didn't FaceTime, only sent short texts at night like, "Pretty tired today, go to bed early." I replied with care, but nothing seemed like he truly wanted to stay connected. I tried not to be suspicious, but the feeling of being excluded from his life weighed on me, like stone. One evening, while sorting papers in his desk for tax documents, I stumbled upon a stack of credit card statements. The mailing address was Richard's law office, which instantly raised alarms. I looked closer. First-class tickets to Las Vegas, Bellagio hotel bills with 2 dinners for 2 at a French restaurant, a receipt for a Tiffany bracelet worth over $3,000. My heart dropped when I saw the words, "jewelry, gift." I hadn't received a gift from my husband in over a year. That night, Ethan came home late. I was making tea when the door opened. He walked in, a faint trace of unfamiliar perfume following him. I looked at him. "You're home earlier than planned," I said, my tone calm. Ethan didn't meet my eyes. He set his suitcase down, took off his coat. Meeting got canceled. Nothing important. I poured tea into a white porcelain cup, placed it before him. I found the Bellagio bill. And the Tiffany bracelet. He froze. A slow blink, his hand resting on the cup but not lifting it. That was a thank you gift for a major client. A female client? I asked softly, keeping my face still. He shrugged. Sometimes business requires flexibility. You know that. His answer stung like a slap, gentle but burning. I didn't press further. At that moment, I knew Ethan wouldn't tell the truth unless forced. I didn't cry. I just felt like I had stepped closer to the edge of a cliff. 2 days later, Margaret summoned me to her house. I went, not expecting anything good, but I had learned to recognize when someone wanted to dictate terms. She sat in the living room as if preparing for a board meeting. On the table was a gleaming silver teapot, 2 white porcelain cups, and a plate of cookies made by the housekeeper. Sit down, Ariana. We need to have a civilized conversation. I sat, hands on my knees, back straight. What is it? She poured tea into my cup. I think you should begin preparing for some changes. Ethan is under a lot of pressure. You understand. What exactly should I understand? I asked, eyes fixed on her. Margaret smiled faintly. Pressure from Richard, from work, from the future, and from this marriage too. She stressed the word this as if it were a mistake, a burden. I said nothing. She continued, her tone composed. There are other women better suited for the role our family requires. You are young, you have a career. You can move on without enduring this for too long. I lifted my cup, didn't drink, just held it to steady my cold hands. Who are you talking about? That doesn't matter, she replied, unblinking. What matters is Ethan needs a partner who can give him what he needs. A child, an heir. That's not hard to understand. You want me to initiate divorce? I asked, my voice low but steady. I want you to have a choice. A smart choice that doesn't involve pain, Margaret said, her eyes filled with calculated pity. I set my teacup down, the warmth of the porcelain still pressed into my palm. Then let me be clear, I'm not going anywhere, and if Ethan wants to end this, he'll have to look me in the eye and say it himself. Margaret pressed her lips together, nodded slightly. Then I suppose you'll have your answer soon enough. I left her house with a quiet fury burning in my chest. It felt as though my husband's family was preparing for a silent bloodletting with me as the part to be cut away. But they had underestimated me. I wasn't the kind of person to let go before I understood the entire game. And they didn't know I had already started tracking their every move, every receipt, every phone call, every unfamiliar name on those credit card statements. I was no longer the woman begging to be accepted in their house. I was the woman ready to unmask every person who had underestimated me, right in the very place where they believed their power was permanent. About a month after that veiled conversation with Margaret, Richard sent me an email with a short subject line, 5-year anniversary, your journey. Below it was a detailed list of tasks I needed to carefully prepare for this special family event. The date was 3 weeks away, the venue, the main ballroom of the Grand Hamilton Hotel, the guest list, more than 50 people, including corporate partners, friends from the finance world, and relatives from his side of the family flying in from across the country. No one asked my opinion. Not a single, do you want a party? Not even an offer of help. Just a list of tasks with my name automatically assumed as the event coordinator. I stared at the spreadsheet Richard sent. Menu selection, flower arrangements, guest invitations, contacting the band, even drafting the opening remarks. He still signed at the bottom with, "The family places its trust in you." I didn't bother replying. I simply opened my notebook and made a bullet point list, as though I were preparing for a final presentation before resigning. I promised myself I'd do it thoroughly. Not for their approval, but so I could face myself without regret. I would play my role, but it would be my last. Ethan remained completely indifferent. When I brought up the event, he only said, "I don't think you need to strain yourself like that. Mom and Dad will manage." I gave a bitter smile. "Really? They sent the email to me, not you." "Because you're better at this stuff," he replied absently, eyes still glued to his phone. I didn't ask further. I no longer expected to share the burden. The silence between us had become as familiar as the hum of the air conditioner each night, loud but useless. I spent nearly every evening after work making arrangements, booking decorators, sampling menus with the hotel chef, ordering custom invitations. Every decision I made was corrected by Margaret in the smallest details. 10-person tables, not 8. The wine should be Napa Merlot, not Chilean, white flowers only, not pastel. She said it lightly, but her eyes carried the scrutiny of someone who didn't see me as a daughter-in-law, only as unpaid help. Richard occasionally called to discuss what he considered matters of greater importance. He insisted that the opening speech reflect the family tradition and heritage mission. He sent me his draft for feedback, though it was clear I was only meant to memorize it and echo it in my introduction. "The most important part is the section about the future," he said over the phone. "We need everyone to believe Ethan is the steady successor and that the family is ready for the next generation." That last line froze me. "What exactly do you mean?" Richard chuckled. "You're a smart woman, Ariana. You understand." I gripped the phone tightly, my lips pressed pale. A week before the event, I went to the hotel to inspect the ballroom with the manager. The space spanned over 3,000 square feet, ceilings soaring with dazzling crystal chandeliers, teal carpeting underfoot, and massive windows overlooking the Chicago River. Perfect for a grand family celebration, at least in appearance. To me, it felt cold and hollow, like a stage prepared for a merciless play. That evening, I came home late. Ethan was watching basketball in the living room, feet propped on the table, a glass of whiskey in hand. I sat across from him, slipped off my heels, and rubbed my ankles. "Are you sure you want this party?" I asked. Ethan shrugged. "My parents planned everything. They take these occasions seriously." "And what about me?" I kept my voice steady. "Do they take me seriously?" He glanced at me, a little surprised. "Of course they do. You're my wife." "Then why am I doing everything like an unpaid assistant?" I asked, eyes locked on his face. "You don't ask if I'm exhausted. You don't help with a single thing." Ethan sat up straighter, scratching his head. "I just thought you wanted control. You're always good at planning. You like things perfect." I gave a dry laugh. "Not everyone who likes perfection wants to be treated like staff." He sighed. "Ariana, don't make this a problem." "The problem isn't me," I said softly, weary. "It's the way people see me, as though I'm just a placeholder waiting to be replaced." He stood, about to head upstairs, but I added, "If you have something to tell me before this party, you'd better say it now." Ethan stopped, his shoulders twitching slightly. But he only said, "There's nothing." I didn't reply. I just watched his back disappear up the stairs, my heart as still as a lake before a storm. The next morning, while reviewing the final guest list, I noticed a name I didn't recognize, sent by Margaret herself. Jessica Porter, associate of Ethan. I called the company's HR department to ask about her, but they said no one by that name had ever worked there. I pulled out the personnel files HR had previously sent me for a PR campaign, comparing every manager's name. Jessica Porter did not exist. I said nothing, but a powerful instinct rose inside me. The scattered clues I had been gathering, receipts, evasive glances, Margaret's subtle remarks, were aligning into a clear shape, and I understood. The party I was meticulously planning wasn't an anniversary celebration. It was a stage, a ritual, a verdict wrapped in wine and white roses, with me as the only person left without a script. The Grand Hamilton glowed from the ground floor to the rooftop. Luxury cars lined the entrance: Lexus, BMWs, Range Rovers. Uniformed attendants opened doors as guests stepped out in evening gowns and tuxedos, the click of heels echoing across marble floors, mingling with polite laughter and classical music floating through the halls. I stood in a bridal suite reserved for weddings, where Margaret had told me I could make final adjustments to my attire. The mirror reflected me in a navy silk gown she had chosen. High neckline, long sleeves, modest to the point of suffocating. I stared at my reflection as if trying to recognize who that woman was. A woman of 35, waking from a long dream about something called marriage. A knock at the door. A hotel staff member entered, bowing. "Mrs. Ariana, Mr. Richard requests your presence in the ballroom. Everyone is waiting." I nodded, drew a deep breath, and stepped out. The ballroom was full. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above. Candles flickered along white-draped tables lined with white roses and baby's breath. Conversations hushed as I entered. Some guests smiled faintly. Others glanced at me only to quickly turn away. Ethan stood beside Richard at the head of the table, tie straight, glass of wine in hand, his eyes fixed firmly on the carpet. I walked slowly toward them, clutching my clutch tightly as if it were an anchor. Richard raised his glass, his voice booming, clear and deliberate. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us on this special evening with our family. 5 years ago, my son Ethan married a smart, hardworking woman, someone we had hoped would bring forth the next generation of our lineage." I stood only steps away. Each word struck my ears with a tone I knew too well, calculation dressed in solemnity. "But," he continued, eyes locked on me, "sometimes expectations are not met. Family, career, future, all must be steered in the right direction, so time and opportunity are not wasted." He turned to me, smiling with unnerving calm. "And so, tonight, in the spirit of respect and transparency, we wish to present Ariana with a special gift on this 5-year anniversary." Richard pulled a white envelope with a faint gold border from his jacket pocket and placed it on the table before me. The air in the room seemed to freeze. My eyes caught a few glances before they darted away. A woman at the third table clutched her husband's hand. Across the room, I heard the soft clang of silverware dropped. I looked at the envelope. In the corner was the logo of a downtown Chicago law firm. My hands trembled slightly, but I didn't reach for it. I lifted my eyes to Ethan. He still wouldn't look at me. His jaw clenched, his lips pressed into a line. I fought to keep my voice steady. "What is this?" Richard didn't wait for me to say more. "The necessary papers to release both sides. An elegant end to a beginning that went nowhere." "And Ethan?" I turned to my husband. "You agree to this being announced like a public proclamation?" Ethan swallowed hard. "Ariana, things aren't the same anymore." "Not the same how?" I asked, my chest tightening with every word. "You know," he whispered, barely audible. I went silent for a moment. All the nights I woke alone in our bed. All the times I asked, "Am I still your wife?" and was answered with silence. I once thought that silence was stress, that he didn't know how to comfort me, but in truth it had been his preparation for severing ties. Richard clapped twice, as if to clear the tension he himself had created. "And because life always opens new doors, we are honored to introduce someone who has brought new light to Ethan and to our family's future." The back doors opened. I didn't need to look to know the name that would be called. Jessica entered, wearing a champagne silk gown that hugged her frame, blonde curls falling over one shoulder. Her makeup flawless, lips painted pale pink, heels sparkling. Her eyes lingered on me for a second, then quickly shifted to Richard, the true source of power and planning. Margaret rose from her seat, walked to Jessica, and wrapped an arm around her waist as if welcoming royalty. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Jessica Porter, a remarkable, young, vibrant woman who has been by Ethan's side recently. We are honored that Ethan has found someone to help him write the story we have long awaited. The air in the ballroom drained away for several seconds. Then came restrained applause. Some guests forced smiles. Others stared into their wine glasses. I stood frozen, unmoving. Jessica wasn't a guest. She was the main event. Part of a plan I had no right to know. They didn't need my agreement. All they needed was a valid name on divorce papers. A man at the table across from me whispered into his wife's ear, "Did they really just do this? In front of everyone?" The woman nodded slightly, her eyes never leaving my face. And I just smiled. Not because I found anything amusing, but because I understood far too well the price of silence, and I had no intention of paying it ever again. I don't remember exactly when my hand touched the envelope Richard handed me, only the icy chill seeping through the thick paper, as if I were holding my own sentence. Everything around me blurred, like I was standing in the middle of a slow-motion photograph where everyone had already turned their backs. I didn't cry. My tears had long since dried. Instead, I felt a thin veil lift from my eyes, and everything became painfully clear. Richard didn't bother to hide his satisfaction. Margaret looked at Jessica as if she were a prize wrapped in silk, delivered precisely when the family needed a symbol of rebirth. And Ethan, he still couldn't look at me. His face was pale, but not from regret, rather from fear of something about to unfold beyond his control. I opened the envelope, pulling out the stamped file. At the top were the words, "Petition for dissolution of marriage." Beneath it, my name and Ethan's. Each page carried cold, neat, merciless legal language. The last page had a space for my signature marked by a yellow tab that read "Sign here," as though I were a clerk confirming delivery of a package to be returned. I gripped the pen tightly. Around me, whispers from the crowd lingered, the faint clinking of glasses from people too afraid to breathe too loud in the suffocating air. I lifted the pen, ready to sign. "Don't sign." A familiar voice cut through, calm and clear. I looked up. Standing at the ballroom door was Laura, my college friend, someone I thought I'd only kept in touch with through the occasional New Year's greeting. She wore a charcoal gray suit, hair neatly tied back, holding a thick envelope. Her eyes swept the room, landing directly on me. "Apologies for the interruption," Laura said as she strode toward me, her voice even and firm. "But before she signs anything, there are some documents Richard and Ethan need to see." Richard frowned, forcing a polite smile. "I'm sorry, you are?" "I'm Laura Kennedy, Ariana's legal advisor. And as of now, her temporary legal representative in a matter involving financial fraud tied to Hamilton Properties." I had never seen Richard lose composure in front of outsiders. He was always the model of poise, speeches polished, his smile calculated. But in that moment, when Laura laid the envelope on the table and slid it toward him, his hand faltered visibly. Margaret gripped his wrists beneath the table, while Ethan stepped back half a pace as if the ground had just been dug out from under him. Richard opened the envelope. Inside were bank statements, internal contracts, printed email exchanges. I recognized many of them documents I had stumbled upon on Ethan's laptop months ago and saved to a private USB drive. Files I hadn't fully understood then, but my instincts had warned me not to ignore. Laura's words landed like nails hammered into hardwood. "We have evidence that starting last quarter, Richard and Ethan diverted money from the investment trust fund into personal offshore accounts without reporting. These funds were tied to undisclosed activities, including transactions involving a shell company in Las Vegas named Blue Turn Development. And that, Mr. Richard, is a criminal offense. A sharp intake of breath rippled through the room, impossible to hide anymore. Jessica sat frozen, her hands clasped so tightly they blanched. Ethan's face drained of blood. I looked at him, the man who once swore to protect me for life, standing there with lips trembling, unable to form words. "You have no right to make false accusations here," Richard snapped. Laura didn't blink. "This is not slander, this is reporting, and I regret to inform you that a formal complaint was filed with the U.S. Attorney's Office this morning." Margaret turned to her husband, her voice shaking. "Is this true, Richard?" He didn't answer. His hands trembled around the file. I stepped forward, quietly folding the divorce papers and setting them down. My voice wasn't loud, but it carried across the room, so this is what they wanted. They planned everything, the envelope, the mistress, this entire charade. They saw me as an obstacle to remove. But what they never expected was that I'd look them in the eye without bowing anymore. I turned to Ethan. "You planned to let me walk away in silence, didn't you? No explanation. No courage to say what you were really doing. You chose the easiest way for you. But you forgot. I was by your side back when you were just an intern architect, not some heir molded by your family." I met the eyes of the guests. Some looked sympathetic, others embarrassed. But no one could look away from the truth laid bare on the dinner table. "And now, I won't be signing anything," I said slowly, each word sharp as a tolling bell. "Because the one betrayed isn't me. It's the law, the truth, the morality you threw aside for power." Laura stepped up beside me. "If anyone needs further documentation, wait for the court's notice." No one spoke. The room sank into silence, broken only by the soft hum of the air conditioner and the ragged breaths of people who once thought they held everything in their hands. I stood next to Laura, watching Richard clutch the file as if he could crush it barehanded. But some things, once dragged into the light, can never be forced back into darkness. Sweat seeped through his expensive suit, his eyes stripped of their usual confidence, replaced only with panic and calculation. Ethan stayed silent, but his face betrayed everything. He stared at the bank statements and financial contracts like they were a mirror, exposing the self he had tried to hide. His throat twitched, his chin trembled. A frown from Richard made him turn away. "How long have you been tracking this?" Margaret asked, her voice hoarse with disbelief. "Almost 8 months," Laura replied crisply. "I used to work for a special auditing unit with a corporate asset protection organization. A contact flagged irregular fund transfers from Hamilton Properties. When Ariana told me about oddities in Ethan's personal accounts, I began cross-checking." I turned to Laura, unable to mask my surprise. "You knew since last October?" She nodded. "And I reported it to an independent financial investigation team. At first I suspected Ethan, but the deeper I dug, every trail led back to Richard." I swallowed hard. Not because of the money, but from realizing I had lived with these people for years without knowing the depths of their deceit. To them, morality was flexible, but money was the only foundation of value. Laura continued. "Over $12 million were transferred in small increments to 3 accounts at underground banks in the Cayman Islands. The accounts were under 2 shell companies, one listed under Ethan as a representative, one under Richard through an outside attorney. The stated purpose was capital restructuring expenses, but no valid accounting documents accompanied them." Papers rustled as Richard flipped frantically to the last page of the report. Tiny printed lines stamped by an international auditing firm left him no room to deny. His knuckles turned white, gripping the table edge. "Do you know what you're doing?" Richard asked, voice low but powerless. "Yes," Laura answered evenly. "I'm helping Ariana stop the abuse of power for personal gain, while protecting the reputation and assets of the other shareholders you're dragging down with you." Richard let out a dry laugh. Shareholders would know nothing if this hadn't been exposed. But you just gave me the chance to expose it, I cut in, eyes fixed on him. By turning me into a spectacle at what you called an anniversary. Thank you, Richard. Your performance gathered enough witnesses. A small choking sound came from the fourth table. Someone had sipped wine at the wrong moment. The room's air thickened, as though everyone waited for a storm but no one dared to flee. Margaret looked at Richard. Is this real? He said nothing. Her question hung in the air like an indictment without a lawyer. Ethan suddenly stepped forward, eyes darting between me and his father. Ariana, this doesn't have to go this far. We can talk privately, handle it internally. I looked at him, my voice deliberate and steady. Internal means when family respects one another. What's happening here is criminal. And stop saying we. We ended the moment you left me standing alone in this humiliation. Ethan opened his mouth, but Laura cut in. And Ethan, she said, her gaze icy. You should know, in federal financial investigations, the person signing transfer orders is as liable as the one who gave the instruction. This evidence doesn't just implicate Richard. You'll be named too. Ethan whipped toward Richard. You told me everything was cleaned up. Shut your mouth, Richard barked. I had never seen Ethan shrink like that, like a boy scolded by his father in front of the class. But I felt no pity, only emptiness. After all those years, I once thought he had a conscience. But before me now was only a greedy, weak man willing to betray anyone to save his place. Jessica had sat silent the entire time, hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her face pale, her sharpness gone. I looked straight at her. Do you know who you're about to marry? Or do you only care about the Hamilton name and the jewelry on your ears? Jessica didn't answer. Perhaps she didn't dare. Perhaps she was just another pawn placed on the board, serving Richard and Ethan's performance. The envelope you gave me, I said evenly, wasn't just divorce papers. It was proof you believed I'd stay silent, and you were wrong. I turned to Laura, giving her a slight nod. Now then, Laura said to Richard, prepare to work with federal prosecutors. I sent the originals to them this morning. The copy in your hand is just that, a copy. And here is the confirmation of receipt. She pulled another paper from her briefcase and set it on the table. The red seal of the Financial Fraud Investigation Office glared from the corner. Richard stared at it like a man on the edge of a cliff. Margaret reached for his hand, trembling, but he shoved her away. The room seemed emptied of sound. Only the ticking clock on the wall, counting down the collapse they could no longer avoid. Whispers spread like ripples across water. Eyes turned to me, a woman betrayed, yet publicly exposing her husband's family in the middle of their meticulously staged event. But I wasn't afraid anymore. The fear had vanished the moment Richard trembled, opening Laura's file. Now I saw only clearly who stood in the light and who hid in the dark. I stepped onto a riser near the stage, my hand gripping the small clutch at my side. My voice rang out sharp in the stillness. Since everyone is here, I said, my eyes sweeping the familiar and the strange alike, allow me to say a few words rather than bowing my head to sign a divorce like some obedient victim. A few faint coughs rose from the crowd below. No one voiced an objection. The faces that once looked at me like an outsider were now filled with doubt. I'm not surprised they asked me to sign divorce papers on this anniversary. For a long time now, I've ceased to be a daughter-in-law in the Hamilton family's eyes. I was only a name they needed for financial strategies, an image to preserve for the media. And Ethan. I turned to him, the man who once swore to shield me from every storm, now standing with his head bowed, unable to meet my gaze even once. You didn't just betray me with another woman. You betrayed our vows, betrayed basic decency, and betrayed your own father's company. I pulled a small silver USB stick from my clutch, raising it under the yellow lights. On this drive are recordings of private calls between Ethan and Jessica, calls that happened while I was at work or busy planning events like this one for his own family. The clicking of phone cameras began. Some people had already pulled out their phones, others were live streaming. I spotted two young women at the table near the window, attaching a microphone to an iPhone, their faces tense like political reporters. I don't think I need to explain what's in these recordings, I continued, sliding the USB into the central projector. It's better if everyone hears it. The speakers hummed, the sound adjusted just right, loud enough for all to hear, but not painfully sharp. Ethan's voice came first, deep and familiar, but laced with cunning I had never recognized while living beside him. I've cleared 3 major accounts this month. As soon as the voting rights transfer goes through, Ariana's shares will be worthless. Jessica's voice followed, smooth and confident. And what about Richard? Is he fine with me taking her place? He'll drop his wife if needed, Ethan chuckled. Let Dad handle the public. As for Ariana, enough pressure from the family and she'll walk away on her own. A murmur spread across the room. I saw Margaret's cheeks drain of color. Jessica sat pale as marble, her hands trembling on her lap. Richard tried to stay composed, but the veins on his forehead swelled, ready to burst. A middle-aged man shot to his feet. Madam, I'm one of the minority shareholders in Hamilton Properties. Can you confirm these recordings are authentic? I nodded, my eyes unwavering. I handed the originals to the independent investigation team, along with Laura's files. They've verified their authenticity and are continuing to expand the inquiry. A woman's voice called from the back, You're Ethan's wife, right? Then why do this? I drew a long breath. Because being a wife does not mean being a shield for greed. I once thought silence would protect my home, but silence only made them think I was weak. They were wrong. The ballroom went utterly still. Then suddenly, a lone round of applause broke the quiet, coming from the back. An elderly woman with silver hair, dressed in a pale lavender gown, stood and clapped, her eyes glistening. Another followed. Then the entire room joined, a sound not of celebration but of recognition and release. I turned to Ethan. He stood there, his face twisted with bitterness. Ariana, he said softly, you can destroy that recording. We can settle this. I was wrong, but don't ruin everything. I looked at him, my heart no longer aching. I'm not destroying anything, and I'm not seeking revenge. I'm simply doing what's right. The rest belongs to the law. Margaret stepped forward, reaching for my hand, but I drew back. I hope you'll rethink what you once told me about a woman's worth. Not everyone born into power has the right to look down on others. Her eyes dimmed, as if she'd just heard the echo of her younger self from an old mirror. I turned to Laura, signaling her to cut the audio. She nodded, removed the USB, and handed it back. Nothing more needed to be said. The truth had already spoken. In that luxurious room, among half-finished glasses of wine and applause that hadn't fully died, I stood not as anyone's shadow but as myself, and I was far from finished. Richard slammed his hand against the table, sending a wineglass shattering to the floor. His face burned red, both from rage and humiliation, under the dozens of phones pointed at him. Turn it off. All of it. No one is allowed to record. This is family business. But no one stopped. The tiny lights of cameras kept blinking. Some whispered that the press was already involved. Others hurried to share the recordings across social media. The cover-up was too late. Everything they once concealed, everything they staged behind the curtain, was now torn wide open under the spotlight. Ethan rose, his face taut. Everyone is misunderstanding, he rasped. I only did what was necessary to protect the company, to protect the family. What you heard is just part of the context, cut away from the full truth. I looked at him. No anger left, only disappointment. Do you really think you can lie here, Ethan? He didn't answer. But then Jessica stood from the head table, her face pale, stripped of the confidence she carried when she first entered. She walked slowly toward Ethan, her eyes locked. "I'm sorry," she whispered, soft as a breeze, but loud enough for all to hear. "I can't let everyone think I was the mastermind." Ethan's eyes widened. "Jessica, what are you doing?" "You promised me," she continued, lips pressed tight as if holding back tears. "You said if I got pregnant, you'd convince your father to transfer 15% of the company's shares into my name, and once the child was born, I would be the official wife, replacing Tuin, Ariana, and together we'd control the company." Whispers swelled into a storm. Some guests covered their mouths in shock, others bowed their heads with weary sighs. Richard stood frozen, then slowly turned to his son, his face like he'd been struck. "Ethan," he said, voice breaking, you used me? You used my name to lure a girl and planned to cut me out as well?" Ethan stammered, eyes darting from his father to Jessica, then to me. "It's not like that. I just wanted more control." "You're too old-fashioned, Dad. The company needs youth, needs new strategies. Your strategy was to betray your wife, forge transfer papers, and conspire with your mistress?" Richard spat, his face ashen. No one laughed. The air was so heavy it nearly stole the breath from the room. Then, from the side rows, Margaret broke into sobs. She stood, unsteady, clutching a chair for balance. "Did I really raise a son like this?" she cried, voice heavy with despair. "I sacrificed my life for this family. Sacrificed so much, I even accepted a daughter-in-law I never cherished, only because I believed Ethan would have a brighter future." She turned to me, her eyes brimming. "I was wrong. I was too domineering. But Ariana, you didn't deserve this. No one deserves this." I nodded quietly, emotions tangled within me. Not from her late apology, but because I had never imagined hearing such words from her. Jessica suddenly turned away, grabbed her purse, and hurried out of the hall. No one stopped her. Not even Ethan followed. He stood rooted, a hollow shadow cut from its base, nowhere to cling. One of the uncles from Ethan's side stepped forward, whispering to Richard, "Perhaps you should end this party. It's gone too far. Preserving what dignity remains is your only way." Richard said nothing. In that moment, he looked a decade older. His shoulders slumped, his eyes vacant. He left the stage without a word, without a glance back. I watched. His figure fade, then turned to those still watching me. No more pity, no more contempt, only respect and quiet solidarity. Laura stepped close, her hand resting lightly on my shoulder. "You did it," she murmured. "You don't have to bow anymore." I nodded, neither smiling nor crying. Inside me was only one thing: freedom drawing near. A freedom unbound by false celebrations, hollow blessings, or family ties steeped in schemes. I stepped down from the riser, my heels biting at my ankles, but my spirit lighter than ever. I didn't belong here. Yet it was here I finally understood who I truly was, and after years of silence, I had made them listen. I stood in the center of the room as though gravity had shifted. No more dazzling chandeliers blinding my eyes, no more violins lulling the powerful. Everything was still, and the gaze of hundreds of guests bore down on me. But this time I didn't flinch. I stood tall, my voice cutting sharp as a blade through the family's mask. "You think it ends with a few recordings?" In truth, Richard and Ethan's actions have been under federal financial investigation for over 6 months. And I, the woman they once called excess baggage in this family, am the one who supplied the evidence to expand the case. I pulled out a business card. The seal of the United States Financial Transactions Oversight Agency was emblazoned at the top. Below it, my name, Ariana Monroe, listed as special collaborator under witness protection terms. A gasp escaped Aunt Caroline, who often sneered at me during family meetings. Quick breaths followed. Some stepped back, as if fearing contamination. All transfers to Cayman Islands accounts have been flagged. The bank records Laura shared are only the tip of the iceberg. Beneath that lies a network of shell companies, fake investment contracts, and internal transactions amounting to money laundering. Laura came forward, handing me a tablet. I switched on the screen and connected it to the projector behind me. Charts appeared, mapping tangled streams of money flowing from the parent company into nameless branches across Florida, Delaware, and overseas. We've been working with the SEC and the FBI, I continued, and 1 hour before this party began, the main accounts of Montgomery Corporation were temporarily frozen under an emergency order from the federal court. Richard nearly collapsed. He clutched the side of his chair, his face drained white, sweat breaking across his forehead. He turned to Ethan, his lips trembling without sound. This is impossible. You said everything was hidden carefully, Ethan. Ethan stepped back, his eyes scattered like a drowning man's. He stammered, I didn't know she had ties to the government. I thought it was just a bluff. A bluff? I cut in. You thought I'd stay silent forever? Let you turn me into a tool to sign papers, entertain guests, and serve as the backdrop for your staged charades? Guests began to murmur. Some in the business world grasped the weight of a corporation's accounts being frozen. A few discreetly pulled out their phones, calling lawyers. Anyone who had signed deals or invested with Montgomery was probably sweating. Not only that, I pressed on, my voice calm, like presenting in a shareholders' meeting, with the evidence I hold. Richard Montgomery may be investigated for securities fraud and market manipulation. Ethan Montgomery faces charges of tax evasion and conspiracy to launder money. Both risk losing company control permanently, if not their freedom altogether. A phone rang from Richard's vest pocket. He pulled it out, listened for barely 3 seconds, then dropped it to the floor. My lawyers, he mumbled, they're preparing paperwork for a temporary resignation to ease the pressure from the media and shareholders. The room erupted chatter, sighs, even a few unrestrained excess laughs. Among them were people who had once stood beside Richard at shareholder meetings, now quietly avoiding his gaze as he looked up. I felt no triumph, no bitterness, only the sense of shedding an old, heavy armor, something that once shielded me but had long suffocated me. I turned to Ethan, my final look closing a chapter. This marriage, I said, is nothing more than a formality on paper. But don't worry, I'm not keeping you. I will sign. But not the way you tried to force me last night. I'll sign at a lawyer's office, with transparent division of assets and full legal documentation. And if needed, I'm prepared to testify. Ethan said nothing. He slumped into a chair, his hands clutching his head, as if waking from a long trance where everything, his wealth, his status, his mistress, vanished in an instant. Margaret sat motionless, neither crying nor shouting, staring blankly at the projection screen, flashing the company's name with a blazing red line. Frozen under federal investigation. And me, I walked off the stage without help. Beneath my feet was no longer the velvet carpet of the elite, but the cold, solid floor. It was real, and it was the foundation I chose. From there, I would keep walking on my own 2 feet. 8 months after that fateful night, my life had turned onto a completely new path. Richard Montgomery's name flooded financial and mainstream press, but no longer with titles like business legend or investment icon. Instead, headlines read, former Montgomery chairman indicted for money laundering and misuse of corporate funds, or famed dynasty crumbles under greed. Ethan vanished quietly from public life. After being indicted alongside his father, he tried bargaining with prosecutors for a lighter sentence. But with the recordings, contracts, and bank transactions Laura and I had provided, There was no room to cover the truth. Both father and son faced multiple charges, staring down decades behind bars. Montgomery Corporation was placed under strict federal oversight, accounts frozen, board replaced entirely. Minority shareholders who had long been silenced now rose up, demanding a full review of every deal over the last 3 years. Everything Richard once held power, prestige, wealth was reduced to shattered fragments across the news. As for me, after my divorce from Ethan was finalized, I left that city. No rush, no spectacle. I sold off my remaining shares, cleared all legal ties, then moved to New York. I rented a modest but warm apartment on the 32nd floor with a balcony overlooking the Hudson River. Each morning, I opened the window, letting the crisp city air awaken my mind and courage. Each night, I sat under soft yellow light, sipping jasmine tea, watching the streams of cars flow like life itself, and I felt more at peace than ever. 1 month after settling in New York, I accepted an offer as Chief Strategy Officer at a rising investment fund specializing in sustainable businesses. They didn't hire me for my degree or financial expertise alone, but because of the story I had lived. Resilience, sharp instincts, the ability to withstand media pressure and navigate the darker corners of finance, all of it made them trust me for the role more than anyone else. I worked with a diverse team where no one judged me by my husband's name or family status. They called me by my name, valued every proposal, and sought my input on key decisions. I was no longer Ethan Montgomery's wife or Richard's daughter-in-law. I was simply myself, Ariana Monroe. Laura moved to New York shortly after. She'd received an offer from an international organization fighting financial fraud. But surprisingly, we also began a project we'd long dreamed of, a women's protection fund. We named it Phoenix Rise, a symbol of rebirth from ashes. The fund provided legal aid, financial counseling, and social reintegration for women who had suffered abuse, financial control, or unfair treatment in marriage. Many had once lived in grand houses, worn silk gowns and designer heels, but inside lived invisible lives of fear. Laura managed the legal oversight, while I coordinated training programs and small business development for women determined to start again. Each month, we met women whose pain mirrored my own past, and in their eyes, I saw who I used to be. But this time, I could reach for them, offering the firm grasp I had once longed for. One late autumn afternoon, with the sky fading to honey orange, I stood on my balcony, a cup of hot tea in hand. From there, I saw the city shimmer in lights, high-rises crowding but not suffocating, streets weaving together like faded crossings of strangers' lives. My phone chimed. A message from Laura. A woman from Ohio just called. Forced to sign a prenuptial property contract. Will you take her case? I texted back, send it over, I'll call her tomorrow morning. I set my phone down and smiled softly. When I first stepped into the Montgomery house, I thought I had found a safe haven. But it turned out the wounds and unseen scars had forged wings strong enough to carry me out. I no longer feared the night, nor waited for someone to rescue me from despair. Because I had learned how to open the door myself, step free of the chains, and create a new legacy, one of justice, compassion, and a woman who dared to cross the abyss and stand firm on her own feet. If you've ever witnessed or lived through relationships where power, fame, or money were used to control, to dominate, to strip away someone's voice, then you understand why I chose to rise. Not for revenge, but so that those silenced like me would one day say aloud, I refuse to be invisible. Every person deserves to live fully in respect. Family is not an excuse to drown someone. Marriage is not a contract to trade for control, and real love always carries kindness. What do you think of my story? Of how a woman, once deemed fragile, could walk through the lines of suffering to become a pillar for others. I'd love for you to share your thoughts in the comments because sometimes a single shared word can be the light guiding someone still lost in the dark. And if you'd like to keep journeying with me into real stories, the hidden corners of family marriage, and healing paths of those who once nearly broke it, follow on this channel. Because I believe every honest story holds the power to stir hearts and spark quiet but lasting change. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next story.